This is video 5 on using some of the basic functions of your Medmont E300 Corneal Topography software. Let's select a patient by clicking on patient case D. We'll double click and that'll open up the file. We can see there's one right topography. Let's select that one right topography. That will be dropped on the main active window. We have home selected, which allows us to create a contact lens from this topography or on this topography. It also allows us to link this topography to any third-party softwares that have been connected to your Medmont Topographer. If we click on the Configure window, you can make specific changes to both the Medmont software as it relates to your practice and clinicians in the practice, or in any information that's specific to the patient. For instance, you could create additional fields in the conditions, procedures, or exam categories. The configure window will be used very infrequently. It is far more frequent to be using the analysis, display, or annotate options. Let's start by clicking on the analysis. One of the functions that we use more frequently is the details window. Let's click on that, and this brings up a window that allows us to learn specific information about each individual topography. First, let's look at the meridian or axes. We can click on the flat meridian and determine information along that flat axis. We could click on the steep meridian and determine information on that axis, or you can change your meridian or axis to a specific angle that you're interested in. Let's click on the flat meridian, and we can next look at the chord diameter, meaning to what diameter do you want to measure your information. If I knew my contact lens landed at 9 millimeters, I might set my chord value for 9 and look at the height of the eye, the sagittal depth of the eye, or as Medmont describes it, the weighted average height, along the flat meridian at 9 millimeters diameter. That measures 1275 microns. If I click on the steep, the height of the eye along the steep meridian measures 1442 microns. There's a fair difference in depth between the eye along the flat meridian and along the steep meridian. This can be very valuable information when working with any type of GP lens. There are additional columns, e-squared value, eccentricity, and other information that you can learn more about from your Medmont manual. Let's close this window down and go to the display window. This is a function that we'll use more frequently, where it allows us to toggle between an axial map or a tangential map. Axial maps, for instance, are the best way to interpret the patient's astigmatism. Is it apical or is it limbus to limbus? As you see in this case, this patient's astigmatism extends from one side of the eye to the other. You can see that it's a width rule patient where the flat meridian is horizontal, the steep meridian is vertical. The tangential map is used for understanding specific points of curvature change. Tangential maps are a little more sensitive to where the cornea has changes in curvature. We can see that definitely the vertical meridian is where the cornea seems to have the greatest steepening in curvature, and along the horizontal meridian the colder colors indicate this would be the much flatter meridian. So axial maps are best to interpret power on the cornea as it relates to refraction. Tangential is the best way to interpret shape, the shape of the eye. There are additional options for understanding your patient's eyes. Another more frequently used map is the elevation map, and this is an interpretation of elevations or depressions in the corneal surface, unrelated to curve. What I mean by that is the elevation map drops a perfect sphere on the eye and says, is the cornea above the spherical surface or below the spherical surface? Is the cornea elevated or depressed? In this case, we can look at the horizontal meridian. The red would indicate a high point in corneal elevation. So the cornea is above the spherical surface at 3 and 9 o'clock. This is where our rigid lens would bear most. On the vertical meridian, we see the colder colors, meaning the cornea is below the spherical surface. The cornea is effectively depressed against the spherical surface. So we have a point of lift of the lens at 12 and 6 o'clock. If we put a spherical GP on this eye, we would have points of bearing at 3 and 9 o'clock on this with the rule corneal astigmat. A default could be the axial power map, and this is the best way to interpret shape as it relates to the refraction and any power that would be created by the corneal surface. Additional functions here allow you to change the appearance of the topography. For instance, we could reduce the color map opacity to see the ring reflection. We could increase it to 100% so that no rings are visible below the topography. It may be helpful to have the color map opacity set at 80%, which allows some appearances of the rings below the colorized map. That way you can determine, is there a point where the rings collapse, come together, or distort, which could create a false area of information. We can change the appearance of the topography by clicking or unchecking some of these different options, and you can choose which is best for your specific office. The selected options here would be recommended as a default. Last would be to click on Annotation, and this allows us to make specific markings on each individual topography. For instance, if I wanted to run a ruler across this map to determine the visible iris diameter, I can select my ruler and run from white to white and determine that we have a 12.12 millimeter visible iris diameter. We can mark this specific topography with the text. For instance, this map was taken pre-Ortho-K. If we wanted to mark a specific point and say this was scarring, and there are additional functions that you can use. For more information, refer to the Medmont manual for specific information on each one of the functions or each one of these windows. And this concludes video 5.